Good evening and welcome to this month's Whiskey Me Live. It is May 2023 and we have two fantastic drams lined up for you this evening. First of all, apologies if you haven't received your whiskey yet. We were a little bit late posting this month's out due to a long succession of bank holidays that disrupted our filling and our mailing. But also because we've actually held this tasting a little bit earlier than we normally do, just due to scheduling, basically. But if you don't have the whiskey, you can still watch live now and ask questions and perhaps drink something else. And of course, this video is available to watch on YouTube forevermore into the future. So perhaps you're watching it and what I'm saying right now is already in the past. Anyway, let's just get on with things. So we've got two great drams. We are tasting Deanston Dragon's Milk Cask Finish. And then we're going to move on in about 15 minutes to Yellowstone Select. For Yellowstone, we're going to be joined by Steve Beam, directly from Kentucky. And for Deanston, without further ado, I'm going to introduce you to Luke Fenton. Hey, Luke.
Hey, Tristan, how's it going?
Good. How are you? Oh, I've still got you there, Luke. You all right?
Have you still got me?
Yeah.
I'm sorry. I'm here. Hang on.
Rock you for a second there. All right, cool. So exciting to be doing Deanston. We actually featured Deanston at Whiskey Me about 4 years ago. It was the last and only time we've done it up until now, when we did the 18-year-olds. And I actually remember going up to visit the distillery where we made a little film that's available to watch on our YouTube channel still. And it's exciting to be back because I actually think this is a fantastic distillery. And this whiskey, I think, probably proves that point.
Yeah, I mean, Deanston, out of the three distilleries we look after at CVH Spirits, formerly Distill International, we look after Bunnahabhain, we look after Tobermory on the Isle of Mull, and we look after Deanston as well. And Deanston is by far the fastest rising star in that portfolio, and it's not a unknown portfolio to be in. There's some seriously good whiskey heritage within there, and Deanston being the youngest of that. I'll bring this bottle into focus so you can all see it whilst I point at it. But yeah, I mean, as someone who works for the company, I'm biased, obviously, but actually Deanston's the one we're all most excited about here on the front line, talking to you about it. Bunnahabhain's great; it kind of sells itself. Deanston is great, but not as many people know about it. It's a lot younger as a distillery. So yeah, we're pretty confident you're gonna like this one tonight.
Yeah. So maybe we could do like a brief history of the Deanston distillery because it's got quite an interesting past, hasn't it?
Yeah. So Deanston wasn't always a distillery. It started its life as a cotton mill. So processing cotton into clothing and various other items. And it was one of the first sort of industrialized cotton mills in Scotland. And during its lifetime there, it has always been powered by water as well. It sits right there along the River Teith, just north of Stirling. And it's always powered the distillery and still does to this day. So after the cotton boom had ended and periods of not being anything at all, the building itself was converted into Deanston Distillery in 1966. So in terms of Scotch whisky distilleries, a relatively young distillery. I know there's lots of very new distilleries now, but in terms of sort of heritage Scotch whisky, it is very, very young. And we still have water powering the distillery. It's one of the greenest distilleries in Scotland for that reason. We use a hydroelectric generator, 11% of which powers the distillery, and the rest goes back to the national grid. So we're trying to make ourselves as sustainable as possible at Deanston. We're not all the way to being 100% green yet, but we're absolutely well ahead of quite a few of our friends and other distilleries across the UK. So yeah, it's an interesting place to go to Deanston. I mean, if you ever visit or if you have visited, you'll notice it's very hands-on, and marketing will hate me for saying this, it's a very grungy distillery because it's not all polished metal and computers everywhere. It's very, very hands-on. There's an open-top mash tun there. You don't see that in many other distilleries anywhere in the world, never mind in Scotland. And you literally can see the inner workings of what happens in a mash tun because there's no lid on it. You can see the mixing arms there. going about, and they're really just there to kind of clear the filter bed and clear the mash tun after its use. And then everything's done by kind of valves and levers. There's no computers operating at Deanston. It's a very old-fashioned way of working, considering it's one of the sort of newer and Scottish whisky distilleries. They've not changed much since 1966, and it's becoming renowned for basically producing one of the most unique spirits in Scotland. We are known for what's called the waxy spirit, and there are only 2 distilleries in Scotland that can produce a spirit that's waxy. Ourselves at Deanston and our friends over at Clynelish as well. And waxy spirit is exactly what it says in the tin. If you haven't heard the term waxy before, if you run this whiskey or any Deanston whiskey around the inside of your mouth, we'll come onto the whiskey tasting itself, I'm sure, very shortly. It feels like a coating of wax, like sort of candle wax or beeswax on the inside of your mouth, and it sticks around for quite a while. And the reason why we've gotten to this stage where we're tasting this whiskey this evening is because Deanston whiskey is relatively young in terms of distillery. We've not found a cask that it doesn't work in yet. Lots of distilleries go through these phases of trying out different casks to see what best fits their spirit characteristics, whether it be light and floral or quite heavy and meaty, and then you've got waxy. And so far, we've not actually found a cask that it doesn't work in. So when you see releases from Deanston, they tend to be in varying different casks and very limited releases, because we're just trying to figure out what it works best in. But we've not been disappointed yet. So I hope this whiskey this evening lives up to that expectation of being quite surprising and being a little bit different to what else might be out there.
Yeah. So this one is matured in Dragon Milk Stout casks. Now, I confess, I'd never heard of Dragon's Milk Stout until I saw it on a bottle of Deanston. So how did that collaboration arrive? How did you arrive at it? And I mean, I don't think I've ever seen this beer in a shop. Is it quite a kind of local product, or
it's actually a popular American stout. Now this whiskey wasn't necessarily produced for the American market. A small amount it went over there, but actually it was part of this sort of cask experiment program that we're running over a long period of time at Deanston to try and figure out what to do and how best to treat the waxy spirit that we have. So this is New Holland Brewing Company. And New Holland Brewing Company produce Dragon's Milk Stout, which is a bourbon barrel aged stout, which is super, super sweet and super, super malty at the same time. And then we were privileged enough to be able to take on those casks and give them another life as finished casks for Deanston Spirit. And it's been in there for a maximum of 2 years, depending on the cask and depending on how the master blender and the master distiller at the time judged the whiskey to be. But what you're going to get here is something completely different. There's not too many beers too many whiskeys in the market that have been matured in beer casks. But if you're not quite sure what a milk stout is, a milk stout is usually a dark ale that's had some lactose put into the mix. Now, lactose doesn't ferment when yeast is added, so it adds a sweetness to it. So usually when you drink a milk stout, you're going to get something that's quite sweet and quite malty. And that's, a little bit in contrast to what Deanston Spirit is, which is quite fruity and tends to be quite honeyed. So we're hoping to complement those two different things together when we bring this whiskey about. And you'll see that when we go through the tasting. So, I mean, if you haven't already, get your nose in there, and you'll pick up those characteristics that if you have tasted any of the Deanston whiskies before, we always got to think about those sort of green apples and pears and a little bit honey. And it's interesting with this one because there's beer involved. There is a hint of hops. So you're not quite sure what hops is. It's got quite floral notes to it. But you do get a big hit of green apple for me on the nose on this one.
Yeah.
And then if you go to taste, if this is your first spirit of the day, which I hope for most of you it is, you will get quite a little bit of hit of alcohol. It is 50.5%. So it's not cask strength, but it's not down below that 50% mark. So you're going to get a little bit of hit of alcohol. I would suggest taking another taste, running it around the inside of your mouth, and just feeling that waxiness sort of absorb into the inside of your mouth. And it does stick around for quite a while. Even before you start to get into the flavors there, you get that waxiness to it. And with that waxiness, you'll start to get a little bit of maltiness coming through. It's quite spicy at the same time. You're getting a little bit of cinnamon and a little bit of vanilla, and a lot of caramel. And then it sort of finishes up strangely with the citrus. Which
I was just thinking that it has a strange kind of acidity to it, but it's the sort of acidity I expect to get from like dark chocolate.
Yes, that's exactly what I would say. Yeah, absolutely. And it's, you get almost like a pleasant bitterness from it, like you would from a dark ale. You know, that's where that sort of dark chocolate citrusy nuts comes from. And then I pick this up. Some people don't pick this up. I think if you just let it sit there after you've had a couple of sips and just mull around in the side of your mouth, a little bit of coffee. You do get a little bit of coffee to it, having almost like an espresso finish, but that kind of sharp espresso finish. It's a really, really interesting whiskey. You know, once these bottles are gone, that's it. There's no more Dragon's Milk Stout. Again, it's part of this sort of cask experiment that we're running. There's only about, I would probably say about 400 cases in the UK, so six to a case. I'll let you guys do the maths on that one.
Well, we must have bought a sizable chunk of that, I should think.
Yes, you will have done actually. So it's not huge. I mean, there's obviously cases around the world, but once this stuff is gone, it's gone. And to be honest, like I said at the start of this, Deanston is my favorite of the brands. I shouldn't have favorites, but I do. And to see it work so well in something so a little bit out there and a little bit left field, it's really, really interesting. And it doesn't lose its spirit character at all. You still get that waxiness, you still get the apples and the pears in there, and it really does have a presence.
I think it's really interesting sort of combining these sort of, I guess, quintessentially lowland qualities of like apple and freshness, albeit with this waxiness too, with something as sort of bold and robust as a stout cask, and seeing what happens. Because, you know, on paper, I don't know, I might imagine that sort of chocolate coffee would overwhelm it, but, you know, I guess it's been blended well and it's been matured or finished for the right amount of time in there, and it does seem to come together really, really nicely. It's still got that vibrancy to it, but there is sort of that richer quality to it as well, which is manifesting as malt and chocolate and coffee and all that kind of thing.
Absolutely. And I'll let you all into a little secret. Waxy spirit is really, really important for the Scotch whisky industry in general. So, 80% of the Scotch whisky industry around the world is blended whisky, whether it be blended malt or just blended Scotch in general. And one of the biggest players in this room that has a top hat uses waxy spirit as a base for making blended whiskey. Well, the reason for that is waxy spirit provides that sort of mouthfeel, sort of a binding agent for all those other flavors. And that's what's happening with the Deanstons when we do it as a single malt. It's staying Deanston, but it's picking up on those really nice characteristics of the different casks that we put it into. So if you pick up any other Deanston that's been in any other sort of cask, you will be able to probably tell what sort of cask it's come from, but still noticeably Deanston. Excuse me. So, waxy spirit is tremendously important, and we didn't used to actually produce single malt at Deanston. Most of it used to go to blend. And now we've decided to be just a little bit more selfish because the spirit is that good. And it's worth putting into those different casks and worth trying it out with different things. But we still do sell, obviously, a little bit to the blended whiskey industry. But if you're drinking a blended whiskey, it's probably got Deanston in it, and it's got it in there for a good reason. It is the base. It's where you start. It's where the flavors cling on to, and you wouldn't have the blended whiskey industry you have now if it wasn't for waxy spirit, either from Deanston or Clynelish.
Yeah, well, I'll confess that Clynelish is one of my favourite distilleries for that very reason, the waxiness. And Deanston's up there too as well, and particularly this expression. I think it's. I mean, sometimes cask finishes like this can be a bit novelty, but I think this one really works. So yeah, nice.
For us, it's not necessarily novelties, more experiments. So to see what happens, and it's already in cask, so we have to bottle it and see what you guys think of it as well. If you do want to take a wee bit of water and add it to your whiskey, please do. You'll find that it does open the whiskey up a little bit. It makes it a little bit spicier. You get more of that sort of cinnamon and citrusy notes coming through. But I don't actually think it needs it. My preference with this particular whiskey is without the water, and some of you may have different opinions as well. But that's Deanston stout cask finish in Dragon's Milk, ex bourbon, ex beer, and ex bourbon casks, available through Whiskey Me, I'm sure.
Yeah, that was the question there. It certainly should be on our website.
It absolutely is. I checked before I came on here.
Yeah, it definitely should be. Yeah, so you can buy it from there. And remember, Whiskey Me members get 10% discount using Whiskey Me Club 10 discount code. So you get 10% off that bottle price. Alrighty, thank you for that, Luke. All right, we're going to keep you there, and we are now going to move on to Yellowstone and introduce Steve Beam. Hey, Steve.
Hi. Can you hear me okay?
Thanks so much for joining us. Thank you. Thanks for joining us from Kentucky.
No problem. I'm actually in Florida right now.
Oh, you're in Florida. Ah.
headed to Kentucky tomorrow.
Okay. Are you traveling for work or are you on vacation?
I have a house down here, so I kind of
nice.
spend some time down here and then up in Kentucky as well. So
Lovely. All right. Well, we appreciate you taking the time out. So we're obviously going to talk about Yellowstone and we're going to talk about Limestone Branch Distillery. But we should probably address your surname first, because I guess there's probably going to be people here in the UK who are wondering how you fit into the Beam dynasty. So maybe you could give us a very brief family history, if that's possible.
it's interesting because I talk about the history a lot, but I put I was at a restaurant last night and everybody was putting their name into Chat GPT, and mine was actually the one that came back one of the most accurate, but evidently I have a son somewhere that I don't know about. But so the Beam family, it's been called the first family of bourbon, and for good reasons. But there's so much more to the story than what most people think. Of course, when you hear the name Beam, most people think of my cousins who have a small distillery or a couple small distilleries not too far from me. But there's so much more to our family. And Jacob Beam came to Kentucky. He was actually born in Pennsylvania, but he came to Kentucky in 1792, and he sold his first whiskey in 1795. Now, he had 3 grandsons who were all master distillers and owned their own distilleries. And that set 3 distinct lines in the Beam family tree. The youngest of those, who was actually the most successful, had the largest distillery, dabbled in politics. He was, quite a gregarious guy and very successful. His name was John Henry Beam. They called him Jack. And Jack's distillery was Early Times. Mm-hmm. A lot of people don't realize that Early Times, that brand, goes back to the Beams, but that was his distillery. He died rather young and only had one son who died the year after he did. So that ended that line of the Beams with that generation. Yeah. Then the middle grandson was David, and that was Jim Beam's father. And of course, we know how that story goes. And our ancestor was Joseph. He was the oldest of that generation. Not a lot known about him. We have recently found the receipt where he bought his father's still. So we know that the still went from David to Joseph. And I have heard his grandsons refer to him as the true master distiller. Yeah. So, but he had a small distillery. Farm distilleries in Kentucky, and he had 2 sons, Minor Case Beam and Joel Beam. And those 2 people were very important in Kentucky bourbon history. Minor Case started working for his Uncle Jack at Early Times when he was 14. By the time he was 28, he was a master distiller, and he bought into and then would eventually buy his own distillery. And his younger brother, Joe, was his master distiller. Then this thing called Prohibition came along. And so Joe went to Canada. Joe went to Mexico and built the distillery down in Mexico and was making whiskey there. My grandfather went to Canada. And so that's what our family did during Prohibition. But after Prohibition, when all these distilleries, a lot of people had moved on, from the industry, our family brought that institutional knowledge back to get the distilleries back up and running. So any distillery that you hear that there was a beam at that is not Jim Beam, that is our family. So everybody from Four Roses and Heaven Hill, Maker's Mark, Stitzel-Weller, all these iconic brands. Joe, actually, Minor Case died right after Prohibition ended, but Joe and his 7 sons, all master distillers, and my great-grandfather went around to all these different distilleries and got them back up and running again and producing great bourbon after Prohibition.
Yeah, I mean, I've traveled around a lot of the distilleries of Kentucky, Tennessee as well, and written about them extensively. And it is remarkable how often the name Beam crops up. Way too often for me to be able to keep tabs on who is who and how they're related to one another. But there's a lot of Beams involved in the whiskey industry in the US, and like you say, far beyond the Jim Beam brand as well.
Right. Yeah. So all of them out there. And one of the things I love to tell people is that we have a letter from Pappy Van Winkle. And when Joe passed away, he wrote a letter to the family, and he said what a wonderful distillery he was. And he was so thankful for helping them to get Stitzel-Weller running back up and running again after Prohibition, and thanked him for that. So all that fantastic juice that people search for, comes out of our family. And one thing in that letter that he did say, which is just intriguing to me, and Luke can probably identify with this. He said, "Except for that first batch, we made great whiskey." So I always wondered what that first batch was.
Oh, amazing. So were you sort of born into distilling? Did you always kind of knew you'd be involved in whiskey, or was it something that came later?
It was definitely something that came later. I attribute my mom, actually, because my mom's family were pioneer distillers in Kentucky as well. A gentleman named J.W. Dan, equally as important as the Beams back in that time period. But and so she made it a mission to show us the old distilleries and talk about the heritage that we had. And so it was something that always intrigued me. I tell people I grew up around the business, had many cousins and uncles and aunts who were involved in the business. But my father, he was just a little bitty guy, and he was in the story business for a while. And I think he was out in the warehouses rolling barrels around for a while, and he didn't care for that. So he moved on. But I did grow up around it, and it was something that I always had wanted to do. But really, in the United States, the laws were not conducive to small distilleries. Everything was written for the larger distilleries and was very complicated for smaller distilleries to operate in the way the laws were written. So that began to change. And in 2007, 2008, I really started getting interested in opening our own distillery.
You mentioned then on your mother's side that one of your ancestors is J.W. Dant. Now, he's the man responsible for creating the Yellowstone brand. Is that correct?
His son. Yes. J.W. Dant was a pioneer distiller, started in 1836, a little bit later than the Beams. But his brand, J.W. Dant, now owned by Heaven Hill and is still in production. His oldest son started a distillery. And the interesting thing is that the distillery is about 100 yards down the railroad track from Minor Case's distillery. So they were great friends, Minor Case and J.B. Dant, because their distilleries were right next to each other. But
That's crazy. So this is like your great great grandfather and your great or the son of your great great grandfather right next to each other.
correct. Right. On both sides of the family. And it gets even more complicated because just down the street, so you had the railroad track, and then you had little town, and up the hill there, you had this big white house with a gentleman named Birch. And he had two daughters. So, and Bernard Dant and Minor Case had two sons. And it just so happens that each of those daughters, one married into the Dant family, one married into the Beam family. And that is where our family comes together with Yellowstone, with both Beam and Dant families involved in Yellowstone.
Right. Wow. It's amazing. So tell us about what happened to the Yellowstone brand then, since its conception and right up till now, because obviously you're making it now. Did it move through other distilleries as well?
It did, but relatively few for a 151-year-old brand.
They do move around a lot, don't they?
Yeah. So Bernard Dant founded it in 1872 when the national park was founded. They branded one of the bourbons Yellowstone. They actually had a salesman who was out west that came back, and he was like, everybody's very excited about this new national park, America's first national park. If we name a bourbon Yellowstone, we'll sell a lot of whiskey. So being a clever marketer, Bernard named his one of his brands Yellowstone, and it quickly became their number one selling brand. And in 1944, Mike Dant sold it to the Glenmore Distillery and the Thompson family. So it went from the Dant family to the Thompson family. And they had that. There was Glenmore Distillery. They had Kentucky Tavern, but Yellowstone was their flagship. And in the 1950s and 60s, Yellowstone was the best-selling bourbon in Kentucky. A third of all the bourbon sold in Kentucky was Yellowstone. That's
incredible, eh? That's a lot of bourbon, yeah.
Yeah. So, but then, things happened. So in early 90s, the Glenmore was sold to United Distillers, and they played around with it for a little bit. And then they merged, became Diageo. But Diageo didn't want to have anything to do with bourbon. So they closed the Yellowstone distillery.
At the time, yeah.
Yeah. Sold off all the bourbon brands except for Bulleit. And that's when Luxco picked up the brand. And so Luxco had it from the 90s until 2015. And it really was just a shelf filler for them, kind of a whatever bottled into it. And because bourbon was not, bourbon was hanging on by a thread in the 1980s. Yeah. So, but Yellowstone hung in there, and in 2015 we partnered with Luxco, and I brought the brand to Limestone Branch Distillery, and that's where I became responsible for it. And in 2015, that's when I formulated the Yellowstone Select, which we have here tonight.
Nice. So, just before we taste, then let's just talk a little bit about Limestone Branch. So, how did you mentioned that about 2007 you were interested in getting into whiskey making? So how did it get from that point to I've got a fully functioning bourbon distillery?
It was a very interesting journey, I'll tell you. But we weren't independently wealthy, and at that time, small distilleries, it wasn't like it was now. There even getting equipment, bottles, all of that, very difficult to do. There, stock bottles, there were like 3 or 4 different kinds of stock bottles. Still makers, there were very few people who made stills on the size that I wanted to deal with. So we built a lot of our own equipment, and then we started out with a 150-gallon alembic pot still as our finish still.
Right.
So that was in 2000. got serious in 2010. We opened in 2011. It was pretty incredible. We broke ground in May and ran our first spirits in December.
Wow, that is a quick turnaround. Yeah.
That's what happens when you don't have a lot of money and you have to start.
Got to start working quick, right?
Right.
I was going to say, Stephen. I was going to say, Stephen, until you've actually been involved in trying to get hold of copper stills, you don't understand how difficult it is to get hold of copper stills, no matter where you are in the world.
Right.
They're all hand beaten. Every single one of them, like even up to the big stills you see in the fancy distilleries. Like it's incredible how difficult it is to get hold of stills. And I did a wee bit of research on you guys before coming on this evening, and it's just everything I love about bourbon and whiskey. Is just literally grain to bottle. You guys are doing it's fantastic.
Right. Well, yeah, and it's one of the things that you had said about being a very tactile distillery with knobs and levers and things. When I started, I really didn't know that much about distilling, honestly. And so I did have some friends whose family had been moonshining for a long time, for generations. And I've actually found them more helpful than the distillery engineers, because the distillery engineers were on these vast scales. And when you tried to bring it down to, a 600-gallon mash, it just boggled their minds. But the moonshiners, that was what they were used to. So, I mean, that was real. They were very, very helpful with that and get me going. So, but I wanted a very tactile distillery. I wanted, I knew my limitations. And so I didn't want anything with computers. I wanted, to actually control everything, so I knew how it all fit together in the end.
It's one of those things, isn't it? It's almost like the distillery will have a soul at that point, because you need people to know if that sounds right, or if that works correctly, or is that the right temperature? It doesn't feel right in here. Like
right.
You heard me say it about Deanston, when there's no computer, when there's no science equipment available, it's down to the guys that are actually making it. And I think honestly that comes across in the spirit. And I honestly can't wait to try your whiskey.
Thank you. And and that's what I tell people, the guys, you can't have earphones in, you can't have your earbuds in. You have to be listening. You have to be smelling. You have to be seeing. And, I can walk in. I travel a lot now all over the world, with the spirits and promoting the brand. But when I come back into the distillery, I'll know exactly what's going on, just by the sights and smells that you get. And if something's off or we're on track.
Yeah. Amazing. You're getting some lovely comments here from the people listening to the history and everything. This one from Stuart amused me. He said, here was me thinking when I opened the package and saw the name, someone was jumping on the success of the TV program. Oh, how little I know about bourbon. Because obviously there's a popular show called Yellowstone now, isn't there? I haven't actually watched it.
There is. Yeah. And it certainly has helped the brand. But, we've been around for 151 years now. Last year was our 150th birthday. And I'm honored. Honestly, I think it's just fantastic and honored to be, the steward for the brand at, this particular moment in time. I think it's a milestone, and I'm very happy to be involved.
Yeah. So this is a rye influenced bourbon, isn't it? As opposed to wheat. What's the mash bill on this, Steve?
Right. This is 75% corn, 13% rye, and 12% malt. And for just like you were saying with bourbon, tends to be either flavored with rye or with wheat. Rye gives you a little bit spicier bourbon than the wheat. You can think of whole wheat bread and rye bread.
And also the strength of it as well. It's 46.5%. I don't know what that is in proof over there in the States, but you're on about 90 something, aren't you?
93.
93, yeah. I think that strength coupled with the rye gives it a really nice balance of spice against, typical kind of sweeter caramel, virgin charred cask kind of characteristics that you get from some bourbons,
Right. Well, with my spirits, and I've done this with we have a new single malt coming out, which is 108 proof. We have a gin, which is 96 proof, and different casks that we do. But I chose 93 because I thought this is what this particular blend is perfect, neat out of the bottle. Yeah. And when we introduced it in 2015, the sales team came back and said, this is 93. Everybody wants 100 proof. People are wanting higher proof spirits. We want to see if we can do it at 100. So I said, okay, let me see. So I went back through. We did everything we started about 89 and went up to about 102. And it's like, no, 93 is where it's at, and that's where it's going to stay. So
nice.
For me, right, neat out of the bottle, the 93 is just perfect.
Yeah, well, it works all right for me. I'll tell you that. I get, people do like stronger stuff, but then there's still a lot of bourbons that are bottled at 80, right? And,
that I don't understand now. So,
yeah.
I do understand, that some.
Well, yeah, the economics of it, yeah.
Right.
But it's just too low, I think, for a bourbon especially.
Yeah, absolutely.
Because I think it can just sort of wallowing in sweetness and things like that, that strength,
Right. Yeah. And so this, like you said, was with the rye. So you get the very traditional, caramels and vanillas that come through with this. Yeah, I think you also get a little bit of what we call cinnamon red hots. I'm not sure if they have cinnamon red hots in the UK, but it's a little candy that is sweet but spicy at the same time.
Yeah. We don't have them here, but I think probably maybe some people will probably be familiar with it. Yeah. I think we used to get them, but we don't get them anymore. And
this is. Oh, go ahead.
Sorry, Stephen. Just a quick question for you, because as soon as I started this afternoon, just having a wee look and going down rabbit holes about Yellowstone and having a wee look at what you do. I mean, because you're doing distillations that end up with, is it like 55, 57 gallons or something like that? It's right. One cask at a time, what we would consider one cask in the UK, 215 liters or something like that. How does that work with your consistency? Because you must have to be completely on the button with almost every distillation just to get some consistency.
And it is amazing how consistent things are. Knock on wood. I think it speaks a lot to our staff. But things are just right on point. Occasionally you'll get something that's a little bit off, but we do single barrels as well. So single barrels, that works really nicely for single barrels. And then, Yellowstone Select is a blend. It's a blend of 4 and 7-year-old bourbon. And I chose those two for a particular reason. 4 is a little bit young for a bourbon, but it also gives it those grain notes that come through, and it helps it really stand up nicely in a cocktail. And the 7 then gives you, more mouthfeel, more depth, and a nicer finish as well.
Nice. Yeah. Well, I think it's great. I think it's just like you say, a great bourbon straight out of the bottle. It's just nice to sip on at that strength. Don't do anything with it.
For me, it's a very classic Kentucky straight bourbon. If somebody wants to say, okay, give me a bourbon that is classic Kentucky bourbon, I think Yellowstone, fits that bill perfectly. Makes a great cocktail, or you can serve it neat on the rocks.
Did you say that you're going to be launching a single malt whiskey as well?
Yes, we have it right here.
Oh, look at that!
Look, there we go.
There you go. Wow. And that's 100% malted barley.
100% malted barley.
Wow.
And cool. It's absolutely delicious. I find myself drinking this more and more. 108 proof, which is up there for.
That is up there. So 54%.
Yeah, 54%. But again, I started out at cask strength, and for the single malts, that was about 118. Was about the highest of where we were. and then work down. And with this one, I didn't even want to know what the proof was. So I just, over a period of days, would proof it down with a few drops of water. And finally, I got the profile that I liked, and I sent it off. We proofed it, and it was 108.2. And so that's how we ended up with 108.
Oh, what, are we going to get that in the UK? Do you know?
We're waiting on our 700 milliliter bottles. So as soon as we get the bottles, you should have it. But yeah, it's quite nice. It's in new charred casks. Yeah.
Are you putting it into refill bourbon casks?
No, it goes into new charred casks.
Oh, new charred casks. Okay.
Eventually, we'll probably do some finishing on it, but right now it's new charred American oak.
Okay. That's really interesting, because I tell you what, I mean, we get quite a few American single malts over here now, but not many from Kentucky, if any, I think, because of course Kentucky's so known for its bourbon.
I just saw today where my cousins put one out. So
oh, really? My cousins, I love it.
To be fair, I'm very much looking forward to at some point trying a Scotch whiskey that has been matured in an Kentucky single malt cask, because obviously the Scotch whiskey industry basically relies on Kentucky to produce ex-bourbon casks. So it'll be interesting to see when that comes about, that there's some single malt Scotch whiskey that's in ex-single malt Kentucky casks when they come about, because it'll be really interesting to compare it to. And just from my own point of view, like I'm a big bourbon fan as well, and like when people talk about whiskey, people can be snobby, as I'm sure we've all come across people who are snobby about whiskey, but whiskey's always different no matter where it comes from, and to hear that you're doing a single malt brings a lot of warmth to my heart, and I'm sure it will in liquid form at some point very soon. But yeah, no, it's I'm just been enamored by your entire story there, Stephen. So just excuse me for fanboying a little bit.
No, thank you. But yeah, I enjoy what I do, and I enjoy different things. You know, like the Yellowstone Select, we strive to keep that consistent, like we were talking about. You know, which is great. And I have a great team, and we're able to do that. It drives me crazy though. I like doing different things. So, you know, with a single malt, we do a limited edition each year where we do a cast finish, which for whatever reason, you know, people with bourbon, when they have bourbon in a cast finish, a lot of people get bent out of shape, although I think they're calming down. But, you know, Scotch is just about always finished in some kind of...
In Scotland, we call them limited editions.
Right. Yeah. So we do our limited edition with different casks as well. And, you know, I try to use it with a light hand. I don't want it to be, you know, like a sherry bomb or an army. You know, I want it to be about the bourbon, but you can round it out and give it some extra... a little bit of extra punch, which makes it for an interesting whiskey that is a limited edition.
It's one question that's always fascinating. I've spent quite a bit of time in the States, mainly on the West Coast. I never actually made it to Kentucky, which bruises me, because it's a land of spirit. And I've spoken to several people who've been there, especially our guys at the distilleries. They quite often go over to Kentucky to source casks and things like that, you know, ex-bourbon casks to bring back to Scotland and put Scotch whiskey in, or new make spirit in that will be Scotch whiskey eventually. What's it like working in a Kentucky distillery? Because Kentucky is known to be humid and hot. And like the comparison to doing a single malt whiskey in Scotland, where it's 11 degrees Celsius, you know, like 52 degrees Fahrenheit or whatever, most of the year, if not colder. And then doing something like that in a place where the water is in the air, you don't need to drink, you just breathe it in.
Well, that is very true. And I have a friend of mine, Lisa Wicker, and she worked with us and then went on to become the master distiller for Widow Jane, and I think now she's actually in Lexington. But anyway, she likes to tell people, you know, we work it was 110 degrees in the distillery. So, it's quite, and that is the only automated system that we have in our distillery is the cooling coils in the mash. To keep our mash at, we do it about 88 to 92, depending on the year or the season. So it gets quite hot, and it gets quite cold in the wintertime. So,
yeah. Fascinating stuff. Cool. Well, look, we've done 45 minutes. I think we've covered a lot, and it's been from both of you been really interesting to hear about the distilleries, and I think tonight's audience have been very much enjoyed it as well, based on the comments I'm seeing here.
Yeah.
So thanks everyone. Thank you, Steve. Thanks, Luke, and thanks everyone for tuning in as well.
Absolutely. I'll be over there in a couple weeks, actually. So.
Are you coming over? What are you doing?
Yeah, I'm coming over. It's not business, although Michaeli's setting me up something. I'm coming over to see Michaeli's and George's new baby.
Okay.
So I want to come over and see that. And then something I've never been able to do when I come over for work is my family, the Bowlings actually originated that dance as well, but up near Leeds. And I'm going to take a day trip and spend the night up there and see where my family originated. And
nice.
Yeah, I'm excited.
Nice. Add even more information to the family history, as if you needed any more.
If you make it as far north as Scotland, Stephen, I'm more than welcome to come to Deanston, and I'll give you a personal tour.
And the same for you in Kentucky. And I'm definitely coming to northern Scotland. I've been in, spent a lot of time in Islay, but
fantastic.
Yeah.
All right, great. Oh, wonderful. We're all one happy family. Excellent. We will end it on that note. Thanks so much for tuning in.